So we've lately developed this slightly new approach to history, biography. And I'm doing it this year with you guys. We did it maybe half a dozen times. That when we choose to talk about a personality, we divide it up into 5 sections. Number 1, personality. Number 2, synopsis of life. Number 3, accomplishments. Number 4, contributions to Hasidus. And number 5, surprises. So tonight we're going to talk about Reb Leivik. What can I tell you about Reb Leivik? I never met the man. Okay, when he passed away, my father was 6 and a half, and they never met either. So I don't know anything about Reb Leivik. I just know what you read and what you hear and what you sense.
What year did you say?
1944. The few things that seem to be incredibly obvious.
Hey, nothing.
And in other words, even though you may not know Reb Leivik very well, but just the stories that you hear, the first thing I would say about Reb Leivik was that he was a Schneerson. And I mean it in the sense that his approach to life was certainly Vayigbo Liber V'Darkei. And Reb Leivik was not a sheep. Reb Leivik was not, as still a bittel de kerid. I'm sure Reb Leivik didn't walk around in the streets making noise. But Reb Leivik was a very confident, very breite, freiliche, proud person. And it seems from the few stories that we've heard, Amen. From the few stories that we've heard about this particular aspect of his life, there was a certain breitkeit, a certain harchovet to Reb Leivik. The Rebbe by Fabrengen once told the following story. It gives you an insight into Reb Leivik. That when he was Rav in Yekaterinslav, it was a very big city, very big Rav. So of course he had many enemies, as we'll talk later. So one of the people spread a rumor that they found him once partying, drinking alcohol, without a shirt, and he ripping off somebody else's clothes. This was the rumor that they spread about Yekaterinslav, about him. Which of course was not very apropos, was not very appropriate for a Rav in such a city, in such a position. So the Rebbe said, "Was geschehen, wenn ich das Kislev?" Noch Sidimum verbracht, and they drank a lot of mashke, so they took off their begedelian, and then his slav was the Fabrengen, weißt doch, hat zerissen jedem den beged. So this was the rumor that they spread about him, that he was walking around without a jacket, and he ripped off somebody else's clothes, and he was drinking alcohol. This is not just a story of Reb Leivik after he drank mashke. I think it reflects the breitkeit of the person's persona. I think that's one characteristic which is quite obvious about it. Another characteristic which is very, very moving, and we know this from his letters. The Reb Leivik, of course, corresponded with the Rebbe and the Rebbitzin, and the Rebbe kept his father's letters, and he even saved them when he was running away from the Nazis, Yimach Shmam V'Zachram, and those letters were in the Rebbe's house. So the letters that had Torah value, the Rebbe himself gave to publish, but a lot of letters were very, very personal, which the Rebbe did not give to print. But after Gimel Tammuz, they published these letters. There's a pamphlet that's called Michtevei Chasana about Reb Leivik. The overriding feeling you get from these letters was incredible love. Reb Leivik sounds like the mushiest man you'll ever meet. Push it. Incredibly, incredibly full of love and warm. His letters are just overflowing with positive feelings of joy. For example, he writes to the Rebbe Tzachai Mushki. He says, "I want you to write to us like a daughter, because to us you are a daughter. And I want you to tell us everything. Nothing is too secret for us to know about, and nothing is too trivial for it to interest us. I want to know every little detail of your life." And the Rebbe's father and mother corresponded with the Rebbe and the Rebbitzin with great regularity. Maybe twice a month they wrote them a letter for a decade, for all those years, from 1928 till 1939, 1940. Incredibly devout and Hadzik.
It's printed?
It's printed, some of them. some of them, I'm sure there's many more, but one of the more interesting little details in these letters is an exchange between the Rebbe's father and the Rebbe, where the Rebbe's Chayamushka mastered on the Rebbe. They have it in the early years, where the Rebbetzin complained. I have to get the supplement. I'm probably very good. The Rebbetzin complained that the Rebbe's not eating. He fasted every day till noon, every single day of the week till after mincha. And she wrote to the Rebbe's father that he refuses to eat. And obviously, she first spoke to the Rebbe about it, and the Rebbe wouldn't budge. And when she saw that everything would help, so she wrote to her father, to her father-in-law. And the Rebbe apparently was very, very disappointed in her, and he was upset at her, like, how dare she? This is my business. And he wrote a letter to his father, writing to his father, she had no right to write this letter. And the Reb Leivik said, she had no right to write this letter. I'm very happy she wrote it, and I wish you'd continue informing me of your shtick. And in that letter he writes to his son, Kimdumani shadayin lo yigia legvorosei shel Shimshon. You're not yet as strong as Shimshon Agibah. You could do the mathematics. You take the letters are printed in Michtavei Chasana, you'll read it and you see for yourself. I just find it interesting that Rebbe got upset at her. I think it was the first year of their marriage, in which case the math doesn't match, for sharing this information with her father-in-law. It's none of her business. She has to honor me first. And the Rebbe's father said, no, I want to know. Anyway, so those are the two very obvious characteristics of the Rebbe's father that I think, he was, without a doubt, a very strong, confident Schneerson. He was an outspoken man. He was a Leivik A breiter. And he was an incredibly warm, sweet man. Very, very hard to get him out of a mensch. And of course, in addition to those basic tendencies, we know, as a matter of fact, that Rebbe Chana describes this in her biography, that Reb Leivik was an incredibly smart man. I don't mean an intelligent man, a learned man, a scholarly person. I mean he had an incredible knack at understanding. And even klugen Weltzach, but he understood life, understood people, understood the world. And he literally had that chush that Rashi says in Chumash, that Yochel Lahalech Neged Rush Kol Echad Vechad. He had the words and the form to communicate with everybody. He was Rav in Yekatinoslav. Yekatinoslav was an amalgam. It was like our former mayor, Dinkent, used to say it, a great mosaic. You had every type of Jew, from the extreme right to the extreme left, as in Yekatinoslav, in Epipetrovsk. He was the Rav of everybody, not just of a select community. And as much as they may have disagreed with him and been unhappy that he became Rav and hated his ideology and his policies, but on a personal level, the only reason Reb Leivik lasted as long as he lasted, Reb Leivik was arrested in 1939, which means it was more than 20 years after the revolution. It's because the KGB Jews used to come and tell him, don't sleep at home tonight. I mean, in other words, they hated him, but they loved him. On a personal level, he had this incredible knack to communicate with all kinds of people, which is a very special skill. Or in different words, I think Reb Leivik was one of those people about whom you could say, he was no Batlan. Reb Leivik was not he was a shtetl Yid. He was born in a shtetl, he was raised in a shtetl, his whole life with Yiddishkeit. But he had a very profound sense and grasp of Elam Hazeh and of the terrible tumult. It was a very tumultuous time. Between 1890 and 1945, right? That's how many years? That's 55 years. The changes that took place in the world happened, probably 20 times in almost speed. I would say what the world changed in those 50 years, what it would normally change in 1,000 years. Maybe even more. Incredibly fast and radical changes. And the people who lived at that time, you had to keep track of all the isms. You couldn't be neutral. You had to take a side. Because if you were neutral, everybody hated you. And if you took a side, you always had risk of being on the wrong side. And Reb Leivik found the way of leading his community under those incredibly difficult times. So he had a sense of Elam Hazeh, and yet he was Kula Yid. Yedei Sa'elam V'chav and limited by Reb Leivik undoubtedly was Kula Yid. So this is, so to speak, some points about the Rebbe's father's personality. Again, understand, I never met the man. You don't have the advantage of the Friedrich Rebbe Sichas describing him. It's a little bit that I know.
What was his relationship with Rebbe?
They were distant cousins.
No, I don't mean relationship.
The Friedrich Rebbe was a great-grandson of the Tzemach Tzedek. A great-grandson of the Tzemach Tzedek. Reb Leivik was a great-great-grandson of the Tzemach Tzedek.
The second one to move, not either.
So that means that the Rebbe, Reb Leivik's father, and the Frierdiker Rebbe would have been a second cousin. He was born up at the Branke, if I'm not mistaken, which is a shtetl. His father was a Baruch Shneir Zalman, a Baruch Shneir he was called. His name was actually Shneir Zalman originally. He was older than the Rebbe Rasha by 9 years. He was born in Tafreshit Beis. That would be 1852. That's the Rebbe's grandfather. And but he married a girl whose father was Shneir Zalman Chaiken, I think. And a son-in-law and a father-in-law are not allowed to have the same name. And as a consequence, he had to add a name. So his name had been Shneir Zalman, they added Baruch Shneir Zalman. But the Zalman fell away. So he became Baruch Shneir. People don't even know that his name was actually originally Shneir Zalman, and then it was made into Baruch Shneir Zalman, and they called him Baruch Shneir. The Rebbe's grandfather was an interesting personality, and him we know something about because he kept a diary which was published twice by both camps in Lubavitch. They each printed the same diary, word for word, same sefer with different footnotes, and I have both versions of the sefer. And the diary reveals a brilliant intellectual, a great chassid, and pushed a happy guy. The Baruch Shneir was one of those Yidden who never really worked in his life. He was what the Gemara calls B'nai Tevim. You know, he was really royalty. He's the kind of guy who needed to be supported. He was royalty. He was a great grandson of the Tzemach Tzedek. He was what they call in Yiddish Tzadski Mishpachi. He was royalty, and he was a Gaon. He was a Gaon Oilam. And Reb Leivik's father, the Rebbe's grandfather. People describe how he'd sit on a train and just fabreng with Hasidim for hours and hours and hours and hours. Say, okay, someone chazer a maimer. So no matter maimer, he would chazer one. He would finish. Yudel Chittik described this. Knew someone of a maimer? He would say another one. The guy was incredible. He just gewusst alt. And he was a freiliche, zugetrogen Narid whose whole life was Teir and Aveda. But he literally never worked. He spent his whole life learning in davening. His children, Reb Leivik, and he had a brother, I think his name was Menachem Mendel. The Rebbe Rashab got jobs for as Rabbonim, and Reb Baruch Shneir writes, I think I'm better off without my job than them with their jobs. And this is Reb Leivik's father. So Reb Leivik was, of course, exposed to a very intense level of Hasidus and Yiddishkeit.
Who was their father?
Who Reb Baruch Shneir's, his name was also Levi Yitzchak. And he was one of the children of Reb Baruch Sholem, who was the oldest of the Tzemach Tzedek's 7 sons, who knew the Alter Rebbe yet.
Did he come a Rebbe too?
He was the only one who didn't. And you know the story, that Tzemach Tzedek told him, if you won't be a Rebbe, you'll get the double measure like a Bechor is supposed to get, but it'll come back to you in 4 generations. He felt that this was in the tradition. He was the 4th generation of the Tzemach Tzedek. When the Rebbe married the Rebbe, he says, okay, not me, my son. Anyway, he grew up in an environment that was kula Yiddishkeit, kula Chasidus, kula Avodas Hashem. His father had been in Tzemach Tzedek's Chasid. Now you must understand what that means. I'm sorry, the Rebbe Marash Chasid, and you must understand what this means. When the Rebbe Marash Tzemach Tzedek passed away, Lubavitch was split. Most of the Hasidim, especially the intelligent ones, went to Koppest. Went to the Koppestead, who was a very big tzaddik, and he was a big oivid, and he said Chasidus, and he could daven a flum fire. A lot went to Liadi. Most of the Hasidim who stayed in Lubavitch were actually the Pashta Yidden. The great Hasidim who stayed in Lubavitch is because they understood that the Rebbe Marash, who was the youngest, was really the Rebbe. Their Zayde, Reb Leivik's great-grandfather, Reb Baruch Sholem, who was... He was so much older than the Rebbe Marash, his children were older than the Rebbe Marash. Rebbe Baruch Sholem was Malta Rebbe Sachos. Rebbe Baruch Sholem knew the Alter Rebbe. The Rebbe Marash didn't know the Middle Rebbe. And they were brothers. There was probably 30 years between the two of them. And in those days, 30 years was 2 generations. He got married at 15. He stayed in Lubavitch. And he passed away in Lubavitch. And he's buried next to the oil. They put his matzev up. They know where he actually lays. So Rebbe Baruch Sholem, the oldest, understood that the youngest, the Rebbe Marash, was the Rebbe. So his children, I think, followed their father, and they also remained loyal to Lubavitch. So even though there were very few great Chassidim, they traveled to the Rebbe Marash. So the Rebbe Tzemchane's parents, the says that Meir Shleimer used to travel to Lubavitch, which was not so common, and the Rebbe Baruch Shneir. The Baruch Shneir was a Chassid of the Marash. When Reb Leivik grew up, the Rebbe Rashab was already a Rebbe. I don't know what was the first time he came to Lubavitch, but he probably came to Lubavitch as a teenager. And it seems quite logical that he spent months in Lubavitch. Now, the tradition, there was no really yeshiva in those days. The Seder in those days was that people went to Cheder. And most people, when they graduated from Cheder, went to work. Sidon, unless they were very successful. If you were very, very matzliach in Cheder, you went to a yeshiva. The first... There was no such thing as a Lubavitcher yeshiva. It's a Tzedek had Lubavitcher yeshivas, but the first level yeshiva was in your own shtad. Every Rav doubled as a Rosh Yeshiva. You must understand, a Rav and a shtetl in Russia in those days, a shtetl from 50 mishpachas, 60 mishpachas, 80 mishpachas, was compared to today, a Goan Elam. A Baki B'Shas was from the Klein Zach. They can gewaldig learn, you know. In other words,
people acted like they could.
No, they knew. And the competition was fierce. A Rav had to prove himself to get a small position. The level of Torah in Russia was unbelievable. There was no place in the world like Russian Torah. And you had the competition, the Chassidim, the Misnagdim. The Rabbanim were very big Go'elim. So a Rav didn't have to prepare a shir 4 hours. You know, he walked into the Bais Medrash, took a look at the Gemara, give a shir. So all Bachar from Halton Mal Lenin sat in their Bais Medrash and they learned, and the Rav would learn with them. If you happen to be the son of the Rav or the son of a Gadol, so you learned with him privately. That's how Reb Leivik probably grew up. He learned with his father. Chassidus, he went to Lubavitch. You used to come to Lubavitch either before you were married and after you were married with money to support yourself because there was no accommodations provided at all. And you would rent an achsanya, which was a bed in somebody's home, and pay for food, which was probably not very, very generous or healthy or tasty, whatever, but you kept your soul and body together. You sat and learned day and night in this medrash. You were there by Chassidus, you were there by Chazara, you were able to interact with the great Chassidim who visited Lubavitch, and of course you were even able to have hadracha from the Rebbe himself. This was the Seder. So they were called Yoshim, Zitzers. And there was always in Lubavitch a handful, let's say a dozen, 2 dozen. Most of these Yoshim were young guys, in their late teens, mid-20s, early 20s, mid-20s, and they were brilliant. It wasn't for the faint of heart. They were all very intelligent, very big Talmidei Chachamim, and they came to Lubavitch and they would sit in Lubavitch for 6 months. In 6 months they would get a yediyah, a amuka, they would get a very substantial knowledge of Chassidus, and they would learn how to daven, which is what they went to Lubavitch for, really. Reb Leivik came to Lubavitch, I don't know when, but probably in the 1890s at some point. He was born in 1878, yeah? So his bar mitzvah was 1891. Shtel's father didn't come before his bar mitzvah. And he hung around Lubavitch. He may have come several times, but my suspicion is that when he came to Lubavitch, he stayed not a week or two, but for months. And he and the Rebbe Rashab had a very special connection. The Rebbe Rashab would say later that when Mashiach is going to come, I'm going to take him and 2 others by the hands and lead them over to Mashiach and say to Mashiach, Re'u Gidulum Shegidalti. About the Zalman Lodge, the Zalman Shneser from Lodge, he said, I'm going to say that I was mashpia in him in Kabbalah, in Chassidus. On Reb Mendel Chaim, he said, I was mashpia in him in Nigle. And on Reb Leivik is mashpia in him in both. Sai Nigle, Sai Kabbalah. It was a very, very big Goan. And it was during this period that he spent in Lubavitch that the Rebbe Rashab taught him Kabbalah. Not he explained Kabbalah to him, he taught him how to learn Kabbalah separate from Chassidus. You know, it's one thing that Chassidus interprets Kabbalah. It's a whole other thing to know Klolim in Kabbalah. And the background is that when the Rebbe Rashab was a little boy, 4 or 5 years old, the Rebbe the Tzemach Tzedek, the Rebbe Rashab was only 5 and a half when the Tzemach Tzedek passed away. So the Rebbe Rashab was a little boy, the Tzemach Tzedek the Rebbe Rashab was in his room, he took his hand, he sat him on his lap, and he took the little boy's hand and he combed it through his beard, like this here, you know. Chal Rabbeim were not into pulling out their beards and touching their beards, but he pulled it through the beard, and he made him, so to speak, even it out. And he said in Yiddish, Tzebersht, Tachtzach Tzebersht, which means, did you straighten out all my hairs? Did you separate all the tangles and the locks? I think so. And then he said in Yiddish, Nadir Ayad in Kabbalah, I'm giving you a hand in Kabbalah. He put his hand into his beard. When the Rebbe Rashab was a Rebbe, it says in Teira Shalom, he used to say, I chab ayad in Kabbalah. I have a hand, I have an access to Kabbalah because the Tzemach Tzedek gave it to him Matan. And this gift, I don't know how to say this, but there's no question that he gave Reb Leivik this gift. Maybe he gave Reb Leivik this gift as well, but Reb Leivik was a Meshuggah and a Mekubal. People used to ask him, how do you know so much? And Reb Leivik wasn't just that he knew so much. He would speak and speak and speak and speak and create and create. He wasn't just chazaning from Tzez and Zayat. He was making up ideas, making up new Muslim and new gematrias. So he says, I was taught. So someone said to him, who could have taught you? He says, the Rebbe Rashab. He said, but if you count up all the time you spend in Lubavitch, it doesn't add up to how much you know and speak. So he says, klolim. I was given criteria, rules. This is Reb Leivik. Anyway, when he became of age, he was 20 years old, he married the Rebbetzin Chana, who was the daughter of the Rav of Nikolaev. Nikolaev, as you once looked up for me here on the internet, is a bigger city than Padabranca. Padabranca and Nikolaev are both in the Kherson. It's the region where Yidden, Lubavitcher Chassidim, were living as farmers based on the efforts that the Mittler Rebbe had made to provide Yidden with parnasa and to be close to nature. And Nikolaev was the big city. So the Reb Leivik, the Chassan, moved to his Kala's home, to Nikolaev. And that's where the Rebbe was born, and that's where his brothers were born. All three of them were born in Nikolaev. They lived together there for 11 years. Of course, Reb Leivik didn't do anything except learn and daven. That's all he did. And he became... I'm sorry. There was three. There was Mendel, Bettel, Mebel. Bettel was the middle one. Unfortunately, Bettel was ill. He was sick. So you don't hear much about him. If not for Bettel's illness, the Rebbe's parents would have left Russia. They stayed behind because they didn't want to abandon him. He was in a home. He was in an institution. And they wouldn't leave him. And ultimately it cost them their lives. Bettel was actually killed by the Nazis. The Nazis entered Yekaterinslav, and they made the former hospital their headquarters. So they had the doctors kill everybody. Bettel doesn't even have a matzeva. That's why in Label's grave in Tzfas, Label is buried in Tzfas. At the foot of his grave it says Lil Nishmas Achiv Bettel Hayad. Just like by the Rebbetzin it says Lil Nishmas Sheina, her sister. Anyway, he sat there day and night. And Nikolaev was a city of great chassidim. The Rav was his father-in-law and so forth. But there was something very special about this young man. I believe it was a young manchik. And I saw it described how people would just try to be unnoticed as they observed him. They watched him go to the mikveh, they watched him daven, they watched him learn, they watched his avodah, they watched his... He was a giant, he was a lion. He was a very, very great man and a very great servant to the Eibishter. And for that period of his life, all he did was learn daven. He was completely isolated. And his three children were born there, they went to school there, and so forth. And life was good. Life was good there. The worst thing that ever happened to him was, he got a job. No, he didn't get a job because he needed to make a living. He got a job because the Rebbe Nishmas Satan gave him a job. And he gave him a job which, if I may put it to you, was most undesirable. I mean, from a political perspective, from an ego perspective, maybe even from a financial perspective, it was a good job. But from a heartache perspective, it was a terrible job. The story was, Yekaterinslav, which is in the south of Russia, it's near the Black Sea, I think, or whatever it is. What's that river called, the big river there? The Dnieper. The Dnieper, now they're called Dnepropetrovsk. The Dnieper was one of the few big cities in Russia where Jews lived in large numbers. Jews were not allowed to live in the Tsarist Russia in big cities. Dnepropetrovsk was an exception. And Dnepropetrovsk had a Jewish community that dated back to the times of Mittler Rebbe. In other words, about 100 years. Mittler Rebbe was the 1820s. Now you're talking 1909. Yeah, so it's whatever it is. And the Yid, how could Jews live in a big city? It was against the rules. So there was a rich Jew who got permission from the government to live in the big city and start businesses, and he said he needed employment. So he brought in 400 Jewish families to be his employees, his workers, and there was no businesses. The whole business was fronts. Storefront was empty. And he was able to give Yidden a place to live where they could make a living. Live more respectably. By the time World War I came along, by the time Reb Leivik became Rav in that city, a good percentage of those Jews were very, very frei. They were very, very caught up in the isms, whether it was Yiddishism or Zionism, or of course the big ism at the time was socialism and communism. Everybody had a philosophy. I mean, it's very difficult for you and I to understand what was going on in the world. Revolution was a fever. Everybody was into, we're going to change the world. And if we have to kill people to do it, well, what are you going to do? It was mamish a fever. And G'dayla v'teva were caught up in it. A lot of the most important Israeli politicians, who were very, very frei, very secular, were the Rebbe's boyhood friends. They knew him from Yekaterinslav. And all of them remembered how they got caught, they were all from kids, swept away by the isms, and the Rebbe said, not my business. I once heard a story, I don't know if it's true or not, that the Rebbe was invited to a communist meeting. They used to have secret communist meetings, because if you were caught in Russia spreading communism, they'd kill you. And the Rebbe went once, he stayed for a minute, he said, das ist nicht für uns, and he walked out. He saw right through it, because communism was atheism. In other words, the idea of helping people is a good idea, but the idea that it's godless. In any case, so Lubavitch, the city of Dnepropetrovsk, Yekaterinoslav always had the Lubavitch Harov, always. And when the Berel Vov Kozevnikov, who was the Tzemach Tzedek Chassid, passed away, he passed away in 1909, so right away there was a big tumult. Yekaterinoslav was a big city with a lot of Jews and a lot of opinions. There were so many winds. And of course everybody wanted it of their type. Some wanted Freie Rabbonim, secular Rabbonim. Understand that in Russia, then the clergy had official political power. In other words, in Russia there was no separation of church and state. If you were a Rav, you had authority to the government, and the Jewish community had to pay a tax, a Jew tax, that went into the fund that the Jewish community had to distribute, and of course the Rav was the banker. So a Rav was a very, very, it wasn't just getting shilas and getting covered and being spoken Lashon Hara about. The Rabbonim had real power, buck stops here kind of power. And of course everybody wanted a Rav that would suit their liking. The Chassidim wanted a Chassid, the Misnagdim wanted a Misnagdim, the Lubavitch wanted a Lubavitcher, the Mara Jews wanted a Mara Rav, and they of course wanted a Paketis for a Rav. And it was a tumult. And the Rebbe Nishma said, Yekaterinoslav has always had a Lubavitcher Rav, it will continue having a Lubavitcher Rav, and he was Pashat Meis Nefesh. He went to war, and he saw to it, he had his connections. In other words, the Rebbe had people in Yekaterinoslav who were loyal to the Rebbe, and they saw to it that Lubavitcher should become Rav, and the Rebbe chose Reb Leivik.
Who is the Rav before him?
His name was Reb Ber Ze'ev, Rebbe Wolf, Kozevnikov he was called. He was a Tzemach Tzedek Chassid. He was a very interesting human being, and a Peh Mavak Magolis. He was known as a man with an incredible tongue. He was famous for his oratory, for his choice of words, and his skill as a communicator and a public speaker, and there's cute stories about him. Anyway, so Leivik became Rav, and the Rebbe's parents and the Rebbe and his brothers moved from a Hasidic hub to a city that was literally boiling, cauldron. Of course, within a decade, everything would fall apart. Communism would take over, and the rest is history. But even then, it was a very difficult Rabbonis. When the Rebbe Rashab, before I say that, I want to share two more little details. First of all, we tell these stories, we forget the backdrop. The backdrop is, it was very difficult times. In 1905, there were pogroms in Russia. The pogroms in Russia were the government's reaction to revolution. You must understand that in Tsarist Russia, pogroms were orchestrated from the top. In other words, the king would officially sanction pogroms. And they were the people who did the dirty work who would stir up the Cossacks and tell the police, look the other way. And they would just murder Jews in many cities in Russia. In 1905, the pogroms, you see the films of the houses burning in Kiev. They killed thousands of Jews, hundreds of thousands of Jews. And Dnepropetrovsk was no exception. The Rebbe, as a child, was a witness to these pogroms. Rumor is that Berel snapped from this. He had a nervous breakdown. I don't know if it was the pogroms of 1905, 1906, when he was very little, or was the pogroms that happened in 1918, 1919, when he was already by mitzvah age. But he couldn't deal with it. He saw the killing and the brutalizing of the Jews and the destruction of their property. And he never got it back. He remained ill, kol yomo. He couldn't handle it. Berel. But he apparently also was very gifted. Berel was the middle son. Leibel was the youngest. And of course, the vart that goes around is that one of the chassidim met Reb Leivik. He said to Reb Leivik, du hast feine Mebel. You have fine furniture. In Yiddish, Mebel means furniture, and Mebel is an abbreviation for Mendel Berel Leibel. He has 3 children. And Harav Ashkenazi, the Matchel Garai from Kfar Chabad, was interviewed from what he heard from his senior cousin, Goldschmidt, the Nachum Goldschmidt. And Nachum told him that he lived in Dnepropetrovsk, he lived in Yekaterinoslav. He knew the Rebbe as a child. He was younger than the Rebbe, he was Leibel's age. And what he recalls is that the Rebbe Tzachana was very proud of her children, and she wanted to talk about them. And Reb Leivik was very, very afraid of Ayin Hora. And he was constantly telling her not to talk about the kids. She says, excuse me, I have kids and I raise them and I'm proud of them. I want to talk about them. This was one of the the politics in the home. Now, he moved to Ekaterinslav, and he found a job which you wish on your enemies. A community which was torn in 4 or 5 different parts. Whatever it is, 24 shuls, a whole array of different organizations. Talmud Teres, Bikur Chelim, Alvayas HaMeis, all kinds of tzedakahs. And as the Rav, he had to oversee everything, he had to unify the community, and he had to please everybody. Well, Reb Leivik was Reb Leivik. He wasn't the ordinary Rav. He was fit for the task. He found a way to make it work. In other words, he never convinced everybody that his approach was correct. He didn't make the whole city chassidim. But there wasn't a Jew in Ekaterinslav who didn't personally love him. They hated his ideology. They would have been happy to have him fired in a minute. But on a personal level, when he came, was a young devil. How old was he in 1909? How old was he? He was born in 1878. He was how old? He was 31 years old. He was a young man. Yeah, 31, but he was a giant in personality and in character and in vision. And he took charge. And eventually, people accepted that was his role. He oversaw the Talmud Teres. He would go to visit the Yivistach HaRov and go to any shul he wants. And show up, and there's a seat for him in the front that no one sits in except when he shows up, and he can make a speech in any shul at any time and place. You know, real Rabbonim in an average Shabbos would go to 4 or 5 different shuls, make 4 or 5 different drushes. And of course, there were people who would follow him from place to place, so they had to have 4 drushes prepared. You couldn't say the same thing 4 times. And Reb Leivik apparently did that as well. But he davened mostly this is what I've been told. There's a large shul in Ekaterinslav, which is now in the hands of Chabad, which was an Ashkenaz shul. The Rebbe davened in an Ashkenaz shul. People say that there were certain things that Rebbe did that we saw, Hastis, Minhagi Ashkenaz, which we do not do because he grew up in an Ashkenaz shul. And Reb Leivik became the Rav. Now, a few more things that are worthwhile to mention about Reb Leivik. Number one, in 1910, there was a very important, 100 years ago this year, you know, the truth of the matter is, this is an important enough part of history for people to celebrate, but people don't even know about it. In 1910, in Russia, there was a huge meeting of Rabbonim. Huge. This meeting of Rabbonim was planned maybe for a year and a half. In 1909, there was a preliminary meeting where a select group of Rabbonim got together to plan the great events of the meeting of 1910. This great meeting was a vehicle for the preservation of the power of the Rabbonis in Russia. The Rebbe Rashab himself went to that meeting. Reb Chaim Brisker, who head of the Litvischer movement persuasion, was also at that meeting, and it was very, very important, very powerful. There was a book published then with the details of that meeting.
Isn't the story there's the person who took the notes?
That what?
He didn't sign his name. They had he said it was the Rebbe. Or that was a different meeting.
The Rebbe was 8 years old. That was something else. That was by the Frierdiker Rebbe during the Soviet years. And the truth be told, that the meeting did not work out as they had planned. It was very painful. The writing was on the wall. After that meeting, everybody knew sooner or later the power of the Rabbanim was going to go. And of course, when the revolution happened, forget power of Rabbanim. There was no power of any god. And Reb Leivik, as the Merebner contains a chassid and a new Rav, was very, very involved in the preliminary meeting and in the actual meeting itself. He was one of the Lubavitcher spokespeople, one of the Lubavitcher brains, Isha Machshava, who set the tone for how the meeting should go. And like I told you, there's a lot of history around it. One of the big issues was that the government wanted Rabbanim to learn Russian, read and write, and the Rebbe Rashab came out against it. So consequently, they hired phony Rabbanim, unqualified Rabbanim, whose only good quality was they could read and write Russian. Another thing which I want to share with you about Reb Leivik's involvement was the blood libel of Beilis, which is also a topic of history which is quite famous. There have been books written on it. In 1912 in Kiev, a Jew, I think his name was Menachem Mendel Beilis, who was a Frume Yid, someone was a chassid, was accused of killing a Christian child and using his blood for the matzahs. Could you imagine? 98 years ago, there was still a blood libel. And there was a tumul nifla. And the taina was, Jews don't use blood. But the Hasidim, the really fanatic ones, they put blood. And they said that Apikaboli is supposed to use Christian blood. And it was a very dangerous libel. The end was that Mendel Beilis was acquitted, but he had to leave Russia. He moved to America. And I don't think anything of his family is left from him, but they survived all the pogroms and the Holocaust and so forth. They came to America. There's pictures. It's a very famous story, Mendel Beilis. Now, the Rebbe Rashab was very, very involved in all of the procedures, all the details. Of course, the most famous little story that we know about the Rebbe Rashab and that Lilos Dan Belis is the story with the Ginsburg. There was an attorney named Ginsburg, very secular Jew, but very, very warm. And he was part of the legal team for the Middle Belis, and he had to give the summation. And the Rebbe Rashab asked him to do him a personal favor, that when he finishes the final arguments and he makes the summation, he should finish off with the words, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. And he did. He was not a religious man, but he finished off the words, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Echad, and left an impact, left a mark on the court. The Reb Leivik was very, very involved. His involvement was various different things, but one of them was, because Leivik was a great Mekubal, and they had to collect sources to discredit this absolutely preposterous notion that al pi Kabbalah you have to use Christian blood. And of course the prosecution came up with some convoluted distortions, quoting some Sefer in Kabbalah about al pi Kabbalah Christian blood, and the Rebbe Leivik had to defend it. It was one of the many things that Rebbe Leivik used Rebbe Leivik for. In any case, Rebbe Leivik was Rav. In 1917, in November, there was the Bolshevik Revolution. The Dnepr Petrovsk is far to the south. It probably took a while for the revolution to reach there, but eventually the Dnepr Petrovsk, Yekaterinslav became a communist. And Reb Leivik had his hands full for real. And Reb Leivik, his reaction was the exact same reaction of the Frierdiker Rebbe's. We're going to fight for Yiddishkeit to the last drop of blood. There's nothing to talk about. And he would get up on shul and make speeches and anger the authorities, and they would call him into meetings and question him and intimidate him and try to get him to pull back, try to get him to be quiet. And he said, no, this is my job, that's what I'm going to do. You cannot quiet me, you cannot stop me, Yiddishkeit has to persevere, and so forth. And Reb Leivik lasted. Reb Leivik was not arrested. The Rebbe used to say by Fabrengen that his father and he were called to many, 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 many interrogations, cross-examinations. But he was never actually tried. And they would intimidate him. The Rebbe once said by Fabrengen that someone threatened me. They said, if I was the oldest son of a Rav in Sovietsky Soyuz in Soviet Russia, and I used to be called into questionings, and if I wasn't afraid of them, I'm not afraid of you. The Rebbe said about a particular incident that happened. But okay, it's quite clear that the reason Reb Leivik lasted as long as he lasted was because he was protected. The Jews, they would come to him and say, don't sleep at home tonight. And then of course they would come to arrest him and he wasn't home. So. The Rebbe's parents had a very large apartment. And part of the reason was because they wanted that each one of their children should have their own room where they were able to sit and learn. When the Bolsheviks came, the apartment was diminished, was shrunk. The apartment was broken in half. When the Rebbe got married, the Rebbe's parents made a chasana. Without a chasankara, the Rebbe was out of the country. So the Goyish neighbor opened up the doors that separated the apartment, and they moved out. So that Leivik was able to have the whole huge deal that he had in the past, and he was able to invite all kinds of guests. And they celebrated the incredible chasana without the participation of chasana and akala. Now, I'm going to pause. Okay?